It's January 1975. There's a 28-year-old guy sitting in his car outside a bus station because he can't afford to go inside and get warm. He has $106 in his bank account. His wife is threatening to leave him. He hasn't eaten a full meal in 2 days. And he has just made a decision that every rational person in his life told him was insane. He turned down $360,000 in cash. This is the story of why that decision was the most psychologically intelligent thing Sylvester Stallone ever did. And it's the story of what was actually going on inside his head when it looked like he was just, well, destroying his own life.
So, let's get into it. Most people think of the Rocky story as this incredible success story. And it is, but they tend to skip the part where it's a horror story first.
So, Stallone's born in 1946, and right from the very beginning, things go wrong. During a really difficult birth, the forceps they used severed a nerve, and it permanently paralyzed the left side of his face. So think about that. From his very first day on Earth, before he could even show anyone who he was, his face was already telling the world a story about him, and it wasn't a good one.
And that story, it was only reinforced at home. You know, a sentence like this from a father to a son, it's more than just cruel. Psychologically, it becomes the voice inside your own head. We know from something called attachment theory that those words literally form a kid's internal narrative. It's the lens they see themselves through, sometimes for decades.
Now, there's a term for what usually happens next. It's called identity foreclosure. It's that moment when you finally give up and you accept the limited story everyone's been telling about you. And with his face, his speech, his own father's words just echoing in his ears, Stallone was the perfect candidate for this. But he didn't do it.
Here's where it gets interesting. He found what psychologists call a self-writing mechanism. He started writing. Not for fame, not for money, but because when he was on the page, the world just went quiet. His face didn't matter, his speech didn't matter, even his father's voice got a little softer. It was his escape.
But that escape was just on the page. The real world? It was relentless. He tried to be an actor, but by 1975, he'd been rejected over 1,000 times. Imagine that. Each no was just another confirmation of that old story he'd been told his whole life. You don't have what it takes. He was completely broke, he was hungry, and he was right on the verge of giving up. And then, he watched a boxing match. He saw the great Muhammad Ali fight this journeyman boxer named Chuck Wepner. Now, Wepner wasn't supposed to win. He was just supposed to survive. But for 15 rounds, he refused to quit. He just went the distance. And for Stallone, watching this, it wasn't just about boxing. It was a total revelation. Something inside him just cracked wide open. He went straight home, and in this feverish, nonstop burst of inspiration, he wrote the entire script for Rocky in just 3.5 days.
And this brings us to this really fascinating psychological concept called narrative identity. It's something we all do. We turn our experiences into stories to make sense of our lives. But what resilient people often do is they frame their suffering as part of a redemption narrative. So Rocky wasn't just some screenplay. It was Stallone pouring every single rejection, every insult, his entire life's worth of pain into a story where dignity wasn't about winning. It was just about refusing to stay down.
So, he finishes the script, sends it out, and 2 producers, Robert Chardoff and Irwin Winkler, they absolutely loved it. They wanted to make the movie. And this is where his personal story slams right into reality. They offered him $25,000. For him at the time, that was a fortune. Stallone said yes, but he had one single, non-negotiable condition. He had to play Rocky. The producers said absolutely not. They wanted a star, someone like Ryan O'Neal or Burt Reynolds. Stallone was a total unknown with that unusual face and that slurred voice. He was just too big of a risk. So Stallone said no, not without me playing the part.
So the producers came back. They upped the offer to $100,000, then $250,000. And then finally, they came back with $360,000 for the script alone. Now remember, this is a man with $106 to his name, and he said no.
Why? Why would anyone do that? Well, the psychological concept of self-concept clarity really helps explain it. People with high clarity, they're more resilient under pressure because they have this sort of internal gyroscope. Stallone knew with absolute certainty that Rocky was his face, his voice, his story. Without him, it was just another boxing movie. So his no wasn't irrational. It was psychologically precise.
But there's an even deeper layer here. He later admitted that he was terrified, not of failure. He was terrified of succeeding while remaining invisible. Think about that. If he took the money and Ryan O'Neal became Rocky, sure, he'd be rich.
But the one thing that had kept him going all those years, the belief that he mattered, would be gone. He would still be that kid whose own father didn't see him.
But here's the part most people skip. Believing in yourself, it isn't free. It comes at a cost. And while these negotiations were happening, Stallone's life was completely falling apart.
He ran out of money. Completely. He had a dog, a bull mastiff named Butkus, that he absolutely loved. And standing outside a liquor store, he sold his dog to a stranger for $50 because he couldn't afford to feed him anymore. Sit with that for a second. That is the cost of resilience up close. It's not noble. It's just heartbreaking.
2 weeks later, the producers came back one last time. They finally agreed. He could play Rocky. The budget would be tiny and his fee would only be $35,000. And what's the very first thing he did? He went right back to that liquor store. He spent 3 days finding the man who bought his dog, and he paid $15,000. That's nearly half his entire fee just to get Butkus back.
So they made the movie. They shot the whole thing in just 28 days on a shoestring budget. And that rawness you see on the screen, that isn't just acting. It's the real desperation of its creation.
And this is where the psychology matters. On that set, Stallone entered a state that psychologists call flow. And for the first time in his life, his paralyzed face and his slurred speech, they weren't liabilities anymore. They were the character. All the things the world had told him were wrong with him were suddenly exactly right.
The film was a phenomenon. It became the highest-grossing movie of 1976. It won Best Picture. Stallone himself was nominated for both Best Actor and Best Screenplay, joining a tiny club with Charlie Chaplin and Orson Welles. Just 2 years after selling his dog for $50, he was at the Academy Awards.
So the crucial point here is that this isn't just a story about persistence. It's about 3 really specific things going on. First, what we call intrinsic motivation. He did it because it was who he was, not for the money. Second, post-traumatic growth. His childhood trauma wasn't just something he overcame. It was the engine that powered his art. And third, tolerating uncertainty. He stayed in the fire when every single instinct was screaming at him to take the safe exit.
You know, the toxic version of this story is just never give up, which, let's be honest, isn't always good advice. The real lesson here is much more personal. It's about knowing the difference between healthy persistence and just stubbornness.
There is a huge difference between persistence that's driven by fear and persistence that's driven by identity. See, fear-based persistence is exhausting. It just traps you. But identity-based persistence, that has a direction. It knows what it's protecting. Stallone wasn't just being stubborn. He was protecting the absolute core of who he was.
So the question this story leaves you with isn't about being more persistent, it's this. Do you know what you are actually protecting? Not what you want, not what would make you successful. What is the one thing you cannot give away without becoming someone else? Stallone got his dog back, but he didn't get him back because he succeeded. He got him back because he always knew what mattered. The success, that was just what happened when he refused to let go of it.